Morning everyone, and welcome to Clifford Chance's latest webinar, Managing Reputational Risk. My name's Malcolm Sweeting, I'm the Senior Partner of Clifford Chance and I will be chairing today's discussion. A number of events over the last few years have only too clearly illustrated that old adage that actually reputations which are forged over many years can be destroyed in seconds. No part of society remains immune. Politicians, journalists, regulators all suffering their lowest level of public confidence and trust. Capitalism is under attack. Reputations are harder to build and much easier to destroy. And this is particularly true in a rapidly changing world. What we're seeing is social media, growth of trading desks, a more intrusive press, increased reliance on IT, the necessity of austerity, together with the rise of the developing economies, which are all trends which are exacerbating risks for companies today. Today's discussion is going to concentrate on what we call the 3 Rs. First, risks, identifying those risks, the source of reputational damage. Second, readiness, what all companies should be doing to prevent risk, prepare themselves and, if necessary, manage those risks. Finally, reaction, how to respond in a crisis in order to mitigate reputational damage. So joining me today for today's discussion are our panel, Rob Crothers. Rob is a cross-border M&A expert. We have Janine Holzman. Janine is on the regulatory side and particularly focusing on infrastructure and cross-border elements of that. We've got Nick Mace on international tax, and tax is now getting into the headlines. And finally, we have Martin Saunders, who's in the litigation area. He's a regulatory partner, and he looks at white collar crime. So, format of today's webinar, as ever, is 20 minutes of panel discussion, followed by a Q&A at the end. Questions, as always, please do submit them online in the usual way, and we will do our best to answer them. So to start, perhaps I can ask each of our panellists today to highlight some of the key areas in which actually companies' reputations are most at risk. And let me start with you, Janine. Sure.
There are 3 broad categories of risk that we wanted to try and sort of focus on today. First of all would be an allegation that a company has broken the law. The second would be an allegation that a company is behaving unfairly or against public or national interest. And it doesn't necessarily involve a breach of law in that case. And third is a regulatory or legal process, such as a merger or a public takeover. And if we start with the first type of risk, it's very clear to us that authorities are increasingly using the media and publicity to try and sort of influence corporate behaviour. We're seeing regulators announcing investigations at a very early stage. And a classic example of that was what happened last week with a number of large oil companies and price reporting agencies here in London who were subject to unannounced inspections by the European Commission. We've also seen a case in the last few weeks where the OFT has actually arrested a number of construction executives in the Midlands area. Another thing we're also seeing is that whistleblowers are using the media. So we had a case a few months ago where a whistleblower actually went to the national newspapers to report allegations of gas price manipulation. So there really is now a lot of uncertainty that companies are facing.
Yeah, and they have to deal with that. Martin?
Yes, I would like to pick up on something Janine said about the first type of risk where there's a danger of breaking the law. And what I would like to emphasise there is that in some areas the law can change very, very quickly. And the best example that I've been involved in is the Arab Spring in the early months of 2011, when there were regimes in North Africa and the Middle East that we had been dealing with as governments, as states for years. In the case of the Mubaraks in Egypt, actually for decades, without any real criticism of them. And then those regimes were overturned. Suddenly those individuals and those countries had financial sanctions imposed against them. And not only that, but financial institutions were told to look at their relationships with those people and possibly actually consider freezing the assets under anti-money laundering laws even before the formal financial sanctions were in. Now, what had happened was not, in that instance, any change of the underlying conduct. You know, what the people like the Mubaraks and Gaddafi and so on had done hadn't changed. It was the perception in this country and at the United Nations level and so on that led to that change. And that was a very dangerous time for financial institutions. Also, we were acting for people who had established interests in those countries, had invested in them with the full support of the government, and suddenly found that they had trouble servicing their facilities there because of these sanctions. So people have to beware in dealing in some markets that governments can change sides very quickly in response to changes in political situations.
Thanks, Martin. Now, let's turn to another type of risk where a company is actually accused of behaving unfairly or in a manner which is against the public or the national interest. Taxes become headline news, which is an interesting development of itself, and it also provides some fairly stark examples. So, Nick, what are your views on that?
Well, I think tax is a good example, Malcolm. It's certainly one that's getting a lot of focus, as you say. I mean, who would have thought that we would be talking about global corporations' transfer pricing policies down in the pub? I mean, it's really incredible. And the allegations against these companies are not that they've broken the law, but compliance with the law doesn't seem to be enough anymore. Actually, the allegation is that they're not paying a fair amount of tax, whatever that is. And whether that criticism is fair and whether there should be a moral aspect to a tax system are separate debates. But I think it's undeniable that there's been a lot of reputational damage and a real impact for the companies that have been involved in this. And the kind of impacts we've seen are companies such as Amazon, Starbucks and Google being dragged before parliamentary select committees and grilled by MPs. We've seen public boycotts and demonstrations as well. And it's also important to remember this is a global phenomenon. It's not just limited to the UK. So only yesterday Apple were giving evidence in Senate hearings in the US as well. And one of the interesting things is how this generates a life of its own and can really snowball. So the media take an interest in it, and because the media are interested, I think politicians have a desire to get involved as well, and that reinforces the media interest. And then you've got online blogs and all the rest of it, and it really can snowball.
Yeah, no, I'm very interesting, particularly when we come on to that later, I hope. Parliamentary select committee hearings, Senate hearings in the US, and actually these days I almost look to see who's sitting in the front row and who the advisors are, and if there are any Clifford Chance partners there sort of seated behind providing answers to questions. It has become sort of actually very good TV for news broadcasters. But let's go on and sort of talk finally to you, Rob, about risks that arise when a company chooses to place itself in a position where it is going to be subject to legal, regulatory or even political scrutiny. For example, engaging in merger or acquisition activity. So let's just have a look at that piece of the corporate world.
Well, I think you're right, Malcolm. Companies have become very used to placing themselves under scrutiny by a variety of regulators. But I think things have changed recently. And over the last few years, we've seen a situation where regulators have become much more attuned to the public and political mood. And indeed, opponents of transactions, for example, have become much more sophisticated in their lobbying efforts. So I think companies now planning on subjecting themselves to scrutiny of a regulatory nature should be prepared for vicious lobbying. And we've seen deals derailed, be it for antitrust reasons or national security or, dare I say it, pure nationalism. There was BHP Billiton's attempt to acquire Potash Corporation of Saskatchewan, which the Canadian government blocked, and then CFIUS's surprise ruling against Chinese companies which are perceived to have too close a connection to the state. And even after the deal's done, you're left with more aggressive regulators now. It's more important than ever for companies to be very well aware of and to fulfill their obligations, including what's been in the news recently in the UK, announcement obligations. There have been a number of enforcement actions recently brought by the Financial Services Authority before it became the Financial Conduct Authority, levying quite big fines against companies, and not just for breaches of specific rules, but also for breaches of the listing principles. So we've got much more scrutiny out there. And then the final point on M&A, dare I say it, are the inherited risks that a company obtains. If there's been bribery, cartel, antitrust behavior in the past within the target, that's going to come home to haunt the acquirer. And it makes focused and thoughtful due diligence all the more important.
Yeah, and actually that's probably a good point to move on and for us to talk about readiness. And given the risks that all of you have mentioned, Let's now look at what steps legal teams should be taking together with their advisors to manage these risks. And Nick, let's start with you on this one, because tax is a very interesting area at the moment.
Sure. I think the starting point for all companies, it's a pretty boring one actually, but I think it's a case of doing some risk assessment, actually looking in the cupboards and finding out what risks you have. And those might be homegrown risks, or as Rob was saying, it might be risks that a group has inherited from doing an acquisition. Looking on the tax side of things, I think what groups ought to be doing is going back and seeing what tax planning they've done in the past and reassessing it in light of the current climate and the current debate. And the debate on tax has brought out a number of themes which seem to be particularly sensitive, and I think groups should think about how they measure up on those. So, do the activities they have in a particular jurisdiction really fall short of a taxable presence there, and how will that appear to the public at large? How justifiable are their transfer pricing policies? Have they used perhaps more, slightly more aggressive structured tax products in the past? And I think having identified what's out there, it's then a case of deciding whether the, frankly, easy to quantify tax benefits still outweigh the much more difficult to measure reputational risks that those things may carry. And if not, can those previous things be unwound, and what's the cost of doing that? I think it's worth noting in all of this, there's certainly some benefits in using outside counsel. I think they bring a different perspective to the internal teams and original advisors that put the planning in place, and they can give fresh ideas and frank advice, and also legal advice would have the benefit of being protected by professional privilege, so it can be very open and frank. And we're increasingly seeing a number of clients come to us for help with these issues.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point on privilege, and maybe we can also touch on that later. But I think, listening to what you've said, one of the things which lawyers do very effectively, and Martin, we'll come on to you next, is actually to anticipate arguments and how they might be viewed objectively, and how actually you would position those arguments in advance. So, Martin, do you want to sort of take us on now in terms of readiness?
Yes, well, in the sort of area that I practice in regulatory risk and white-collar crime, I think there are a few points that I would echo from what Nick has said about the importance of risk assessments. And I would say that regulatory action often follows trends. It could start with an announcement that they're looking at this and a particular issue, and then it will snowball, and they will often then seek to make examples of people through a few high-profile enforcement actions. So it's extremely important to be very alive to what trends are emerging. I also think that increasingly there's great importance in getting your policies and procedures right. Now, that has been the case with financial services regulation for many years. The FSA, as it was now the Financial Conduct Authority, has disciplined many businesses for not having systems and controls in areas like insurance brokers for not having anti-bribery procedures. Private banks, one was disciplined recently, a number have been disciplined for not having anti-money laundering procedures that are quite up to the required standard. And it's important to note these institutions haven't actually been accused of money laundering or of paying bribes. It's purely the way that their systems aren't judged to be robust enough. To some extent, we're seeing that actually creep into the criminal law in areas like the Bribery Act, where it's not actually a crime not to have anti-corruption procedures, but you won't have the benefit of defence if one of your agents does pay bribes. So I think that could be an emerging trend. The other thing I would say about preparation under policies and procedures is that businesses should make sure that their procedures are realistic, because if they're gold-plated, and don't provide for any exemptions or any flexibility, even with senior management approval, then the easiest way of disciplining a company is to say, well, actually, you haven't complied with your own procedures, therefore, how can you have any confidence at all as to what, you're following? So make them realistic and don't try and go for unrealistic standards.
Yeah. So regulation increasing exponentially, very, very difficult to navigate. And to an extent, actually, we're seeing creeping criminalisation in that whole area. So very, very interesting.
Yeah.
Rob, corporate area.
I think, excuse me, maybe not just in the corporate area, but stepping back and looking at what comes next once you've got your policies and procedures and you've identified your risks. And I think that's thinking about your response if the worst does happen. As far as we can tell, those clients we've seen where things have spiraled out of control versus those who've contained a problem, in large part it comes down to the coordination of their internal teams. How closely and effectively are the PR, comms, legal, maybe even tax teams working together to respond? And you can't just put that together when the worst happens. You've got to be doing that in advance and preparing. So put those processes in place now, I'd say. And plan the various reactions to the likely scenarios or the possible scenarios. How would you respond if it was a regulator asking you questions? Would that be different if it was the media or the parliamentary select committees or congressional committees that you and Nick have alluded to? Is your tendency towards transparency and putting all your cards on the table, or is it to be very reticent about disclosing information or perhaps stonewalling, if you like? And you really do have to think these things through in advance. Trying to come to these decisions in the sort of white heat of a live situation is often a recipe for disaster. Maybe one last thing on that, and one that is perhaps so obvious in this day and age, but I'd like to emphasize it anyway, and that's the being careful what you commit to paper or to email. Many a company have started off a crisis in an even worse situation than they might have been due to incriminating and often misleading email trails, but they make the situation worse. So those are some of the things you should be thinking about. But I know, Janine, one of the things close to your heart is not just thinking about it, but also practice.
Yeah, look, it's really important to try and sort of actually do that dry run. What we found with competition authorities is that they often will do sort of dawn raids or unannounced inspections. So you have a situation where sort of 10, 12 people turn up at your front door, asked to be let in. The first thing they will do is they will focus on access to your IT systems, as Rob was saying earlier. They'll look at BlackBerries, they'll look at emails, they'll look at instant messaging. And you really can't say no, because obstructing an investigation like that can carry a very large fine. We've seen fines of up to 38 million euros in the past. So it's really important not only to sort of update the dawn raid guidelines and to have a look at a sort of modern practice of investigating authorities, but actually do a dry run, get the teams together so that you can work out if you have got proper coordination between everyone from reception staff through to legal, through to the PR teams, the public policy teams and the IT teams. I think, practicing really brings out those issues and helps people prepare for the worst.
Anyway, I'm very pleased to hear that they do actually knock on the door. I have this image of people barging into the building. But however assiduous one might be in actually preparing, things will always go wrong. They just do. True. But based on your experience, what do you think distinguishes those companies that survive the reputational challenges from those that don't? So, Rob, let's take you first.
I suppose the first piece of advice I'd give is don't feel compelled to react immediately, unless, of course, in situations like Janine outlines, you have to. But for those types of situations, it does pay to just pause for thought, if I can put it that way. The 24-hour news cycle pushes you to reply or to respond, and it often means that you're not getting the best out of all your teams, and you're not being able to put in place those coordinated policies that we mentioned earlier. Anything you say when you first react is going to be carefully scrutinized, and not just by the media and perhaps your customers, but also by shareholders and regulators. And so it needs to be carefully considered so as not to expose you to any further liability or future action. You also want to be very careful that anything you're saying is as comprehensive as you want to make it. In some ways, there's nothing worse than the truth beginning to drip out over the coming days or weeks. That really perpetuates the news cycle. And it's in this area that the coordination, which hopefully you've engaged in earlier, between your internal teams and where necessary external advisors should really pay off. And I would say it is worth thinking about who you want to involve and getting your advisors in early. Because getting advice early on at the right time can make a real difference and can prevent you tripping over yourself.
Yeah, so comprehensive coordinated preparation. Martin, these are all things which presumably you would echo. These are all thoughts you would echo.
Absolutely, particularly about being careful what you say in any potential criminal environment where, quite literally things may be taken down and used against you. But the other thing I think is very important is 360-degree vision in any regulated business and indeed in any area where there are cross-border criminal investigations involved. There is now, to some extent, I'm afraid, competition between regulators and between law enforcement agencies. There always seems, in particular, to be competition between the Americans and the British, but that's not the only example. To some extent now, the Europeans are rushing to be first and follow their national agendas. And one of the worst mistakes that a business can make is just to sort of notify one regulator and keep that regulator or law enforcement agency happy without notifying other regulators, particularly in different jurisdictions. And if you look actually at the guidance that the Serious Fraud Office has published in the past on reporting suspicions of bribery, self-reporting by businesses, they make it quite clear that if you report to the US Department of Justice, they expect to be notified at the same time. So I feel that that coordination is extremely important and one of the things that can help people through the crisis of those first few days when things go wrong.
So global response maybe to a local issue. Janine?
Yeah, I guess just echoing what sort of Martin has said, because I think, again, we tend to deal with competition authorities around the world and you have to manage all of them. And you do see sort of cases where an investigation has occurred in one country, suddenly antitrust authorities in other countries will start sort of requesting the same information. Yeah. And there's a decision to be made as to whether you're going to send your documents out of jurisdiction or not. And that's an important decision that needs to be sort of made with legal input. And then that needs to tie in with your PR strategy. So, you can't really have a PR message which says you're cooperating with authorities in other jurisdictions when actually you're not. That would really be an own goal. And again, I think, another strategy that we see used often in a PR context is to say that there will be an internal investigation. And often that can work really well. But again, it's really important to note that any internal investigation you carry out, unless it's conducted in a European context by external lawyers, will not be privileged and so may therefore have to be disclosed. So that internal investigation, again, needs to just be thought through and set up sort of properly. And I guess the last thing that I'd sort of say is just about making sure that you keep an eye on whether the interests of senior management and your directors are aligned with the interests of the company. That's been quite a big issue in the antitrust field. We had a case where Safeway actually brought a court case against its senior executives to try and recoup some of the money that had been paid out in fines. The case was thrown out, but it really did sort of throw into stark relief this idea that there are sanctions and potential consequences for individuals. We've seen people such as senior BA executives go to jail in the US for these sorts of infringements. So just keeping an eye on that's really important.
Yeah, some interesting points. And actually touching again on that privilege point, the information trail and how you would use privilege and actually the cross-border elements of managing privilege and information, all very interesting.
Really, really important, particularly in Europe, because under European law, in-house counsel don't actually enjoy legal privilege. Indeed. And while we can debate whether that's right, that's the way it is at the moment.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks, Janine. So there you have it. We have received a few questions for our panel, so I'd quite like to put those to them now. And the first one to have come in is somebody who's a director, and he says, this obviously goes to you, Nick, do I have a statutory obligation to pay a particular amount of tax? So he's obviously been reading the headlines and looking at the news and is worried about this whole move to fairness and transparency.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, actually, and it's come up in the Public Account Committee hearings. There's been a suggestion that the Companies Act requirement for directors to have regard to the impact of the company's operations on the community is completely incompatible with any form of tax mitigation. I'm not actually sure that that's correct. I think the director's duty is, in fact, to promote the success of the company for the benefit of the members as a whole, and colloquially that's often put as maximising the profits of the company, and that's really an overriding legal duty that directors have, and whilst they can have regard to other things, that those don't supersede that main duty. I mean, it's important, though, to remember that it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have regard to things like reputational issues and what the public will think about your actions, because clearly, if there's a huge backlash against what you do, then that's unlikely to be to the benefit of the members of the company as a whole.
Yeah, great. No, thanks, Nick. And we've got, I think, time for just one more question. And it seems that, Janine, you have clearly concerned one of our viewers today. But actually, I won't go to you. I'll go to Rob and I think Martin for this question. And it's come from somebody who is a director and is clearly concerned as to when their interests may diverge from the corporate interest and when they would require separate advice and how that would be managed and what their position would be. Rob, let's start with you.
I think it's important to perhaps start by saying in most cases, the directors, whether they be an executive director or a non-executive director, that their interests are going to be aligned with that of the company. So there doesn't need to be a knee-jerk reaction to immediately get separate advice for either directors or indeed senior executives or anyone else who has the potential to become implicated or for their interests to diverge. However, I think it is a very good point, and it is important for the chairman of companies or the general counsel or company secretary to be alive for situations where, particularly in a criminal context, there may be opportunities for regulators to increase pressure on the company by going after individuals and to get the advice they need for those individuals early enough that those individuals can be protected alongside the company. Because although the interests diverge, I don't think it's really ever true to say that if either of them can be made a scapegoat for the other. They tend to stand or fall together even if the interests are subtly different.
And maybe just take 30 seconds of your perspective on this from a litigation.
I think I would largely agree with that. I think one does have to sometimes be careful, though, in the context of regulated firms, and I have in mind, again, in particular, firms that are regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. There are particular types of directors, like chairmen of audit committees and so on, that are entrusted with particular functions, and they can be investigated as individuals. So even if the board as a whole is one thing, but if individuals haven't fulfilled their particular obligations, they can be criticised and even disciplined as individuals. So sometimes there is a need for separate representation.
Yeah. Okay, that's very helpful. So let's finish today by asking each of our panel for just a key takeaway message for our audience. So let's start with you, Rob.
I guess for me it would be almost all companies out there are very alert to yesterday's risks, but we're in a rapidly changing world, and my question to companies would be, do they really understand the risks they face today and are going to face tomorrow?
Yeah, and I think I'm sort of just picking up on what Rob said. I guess I'd sort of say just, particularly in the antitrust field, update your Dawn Raid training because the world has moved on and the European Commission and national authorities are doing things differently. And then if you are investigated, obviously make sure the PR and legal strategy, are consistent and keep them sort of dovetailed and consistent.
Good, thanks.
My advice would be to prepare now. Don't wait to consider how this debate about tax affects you until you get called by an aggressive journalist or get your invite to appear before a select committee hearing. By then, it's probably too late.
Yeah.
Well, I would say always have 360-degree vision about different jurisdictions. Don't try and take one approach across the board without taking local advice. Because sometimes if you have a very Anglo-Saxon-centric view of things, you can very quickly make matters worse in other countries.
Yeah. What is clear from today's debate is that risk is quite clearly increasing. It's top of the agenda for our clients. Almost impossible for us in 20 minutes to 30 minutes to actually go through just the multitude of risks which people face and how they might address them. But I think you've done a sterling job, so thanks to our panel, thanks to Rob, Janine, Nick and Martin, and thank you all again for tuning in to this webinar today. Our next webinar is on the 12th of June and it's going to cover corporates and putting corporate cash to work, so we hope to see you then. Goodbye and enjoy the rest of the day.